The train arrived 20 minutes late, which she considered an honest beginning. She had watched Montana come to meet her through the smeared glass of the passenger window, the sky enormous and pale as old bone, the grass flattened by wind that seemed to have been blowing since before anyone had a name for this territory. It was nothing like Ohio. Ohio had fences that meant something, trees that stood in deliberate rows, a sky that knew its own limits. This sky did not. She pressed one gloved hand against the cold glass and made a private note of it. The land here does not apologize for itself. He was waiting at the depot. She recognized him from the photograph, though he was taller than she had expected, and the expression in the photograph, a kind of careful neutrality, turned out to be simply his face. He wore it like a coat that had been tailored young and never altered. He removed his hat when she stepped from the train, and that, she thought, was something. A man who removes his hat has been taught that women are worth the gesture, even if he has not yet learned to mean it. He loaded her trunk himself, which surprised the porter and seemed to surprise no one else. They rode to the ranch in a wagon that smelled of pine resin and cold iron, and he spoke about the property with the careful pride of a man reciting a document he had authored himself. The acreage, the herd count, the new water line he had laid in from the creek. She listened. She was very good at listening. It was a skill that looked like passivity to those who did not understand how much information a quiet woman could collect. The house was large, larger than the advertisement had implied. He showed her through it with the same measured ceremony he had probably used to show buyers through his cattle records. This room, that room, the kitchen, the parlor, the hall. And then he opened a door off the master bedchamber and stood back with something close to expectation on his face. The room was small and perfect. Mirrored shelves lined 3 walls, catching the lamplight and throwing it back in warm, doubled fragments. A velvet-topped vanity table sat beneath the window. On the shelves, arranged with obvious care, stood rows of imported French perfume bottles, amber and violet and sea glass green, their stoppers glinting like small crowns. He had built this room for a woman he had imagined. She could see the whole of that imagined woman in the arrangement of the bottles. She looked at the shelves for a long moment. Her expression, had anyone been cataloging it, was entirely unreadable. "Thank you," she said. "It's lovely." He nodded, satisfied in the way of a man who has paid for something expensive and been correctly thanked for it, and left her to settle. That night, when the house had gone quiet around her, she lifted the latch of her trunk and began to take inventory of what she had brought. The canning kettle, the jars, the ledger, the provisions. She had exactly 3 weeks. She began the next morning, before the cook had finished with breakfast. The perfume bottles came down one by one. She lifted each carefully, wrapped it in the cloth she had set aside for the purpose, and tucked it into the nested layers of her trunk with the methodical patience of a woman who has moved fragile things before and intends to move them safely. Amber glass, violet glass, the small sea-green bottles with their glinting stoppers. She treated none of them carelessly. They were beautiful objects, and she had no quarrel with beautiful objects. She simply had no use for them, and, in her experience, useless things had a way of becoming burdens. When the shelves were empty, she studied them for a moment. 3 walls of mirrored surface, each shelf wiped with the accumulated fingerprints of anticipation. Then she filled a basin with water, added a measure of vinegar from the small bottle she kept in her trunk, and washed every shelf from top to bottom with a clean rag. The room smelled sharply of vinegar for a quarter of an hour. Then it smelled of nothing, which was exactly what she wanted. She was on the second wall when he appeared in the doorway. He looked at the empty shelves. He looked at the basin. He looked at the trunk, which sat open and half full of wrapped bottles arranged with more care than they had perhaps received on any shelf in France. "What are you doing?" he asked. The question was measured, but the thing behind it was not entirely comfortable. She dipped the rag, wrung it, and drew it along the next shelf in a single even stroke before she answered. "I intend to use this room," she said. He waited. This was, in her observation, a habit of his, waiting for a woman to fill silence with explanation, apology, or reassurance. She offered none of the three. She moved the rag to the next length of shelf and continued working. "Use it," he repeated. "Yes." She could feel him calculating. The mind of a man who had built a cattle fortune was not a slow mind. She had understood that immediately, but it was a mind accustomed to a particular set of variables. Women who arrived in rooms filled with expensive things generally wished to keep the expensive things. This was a reasonable assumption, and it was wrong. "I'll have Hendricks bring up whatever you need," he said at last, "if you want different shelving or another table." "The shelves are fine," she said. "I'll manage the rest myself." He nodded once in the manner of a man who has discharged his obligation and may now return to familiar territory. She heard his footsteps moving back down the hall toward the stairs, toward the ledgers and the land maps and the world that answered him in a language he had chosen. He had not asked a second question. She had noticed, and she tucked that observation away beside the others she was accumulating, the way one stores anything small and useful, carefully, where it will not be lost. The shelves were clean by noon. She began with the eggs. They had come packed in sawdust inside the trunk, 24 of them wrapped in cloth, already hard-boiled and cooled before she had left Ohio. She had planned for the train's motion and the cold of the October cars, and she had packed accordingly, and not one had cracked. This, she thought, was the difference between a woman who prepared and a woman who hoped, and she had long since stopped hoping for things she could simply arrange. The canning kettle went onto the small iron stove the housekeeper had lit for her without being asked. The brine came next, vinegar and salt and a measure of sugar, a thread of dried dill, 3 cloves of garlic split but not crushed, the way her grandmother's ledger specified in the particular cramped script of a woman who had fed a family through 2 hard winters on a single cellar's worth of preserved food. She did not rush the heating. Brine that scalded too quickly turned cloudy, and she intended her jars to be clear. While it simmered, she arranged the first empty jars on the mirrored shelf. The glass caught the light in the way glass always does when it is clean and waiting, honestly, without pretense, and she found herself approving of the shelves after all. They were the right height. They were the right depth. Whoever had built them had understood proportion, even if they had misunderstood purpose. The first jar sealed just after 2 o'clock. She set it on the center shelf. Pale and luminous in its brine, the eggs floated with a kind of quiet patience that she recognized and respected. The jar sat there the way a true thing sits, without apology, without explanation, certain of its own usefulness. She did not hear the foreman until his shadow fell across the doorway. He was a weathered man, the sort the West produced in quantity, economical of word and expression, with hands that knew the weight of rope and the temperature of wind. He had been passing, presumably, from one task to another. He was not passing now. He stood in the doorway, looking at the single jar on the mirrored shelf, and his face did something she had not yet seen on this ranch. It settled. The particular way a face settles when a number has come out correctly in a long calculation. He did not speak. She did not explain. He moved on. That evening the worry arrived, carried in the rancher's voice like weather moving across open ground. She heard it from the hall before she saw his face, that particular tightening of a controlled man who has encountered a problem he cannot solve with money alone. The cook, it seemed, was bedridden. Something in the lungs, the housekeeper had said, and the drive was not 3 weeks out as they had estimated. It was 2 weeks, perhaps less. 40 men, no cook, the frost coming like a sentence that had already been written. She returned to the stove and began measuring vinegar for the second batch. The neighboring rancher's wife arrived at 10:30 on a Tuesday, which was precisely the hour a woman of her standing chose when she wished to catch a household unprepared. She came in a well-sprung buggy with a lap blanket the color of cream and a visiting card she presented to the housemaid at the door, as though the card itself were the important guest. The housekeeper was occupied with the larder inventory. The housemaid, new to the ranch and eager to demonstrate her competence, offered to show the visitor the house. This was the mistake, though no one could fairly blame the girl. She did not know. She showed the parlor, the good sideboard, the curtains from St. Louis that the rancher had ordered to demonstrate his prosperity, and then, because it was adjacent to the upper hall and the door stood open, the small private room. The neighboring rancher's wife stepped inside. What followed was not dramatic in the usual way of things. There was no gasp, no cry. There was, instead, a silence of the particular variety that is louder than noise, a silence with texture, with temperature. The woman stood before the mirrored shelves and looked at the rows of sealed jars, at the onions suspended in pale brine, at the dark curve of eggs through glass, at the dried herbs bundled and hanging from the window latch, where a curtain tie had previously lived. She pressed one hand to her collar, slowly, as though checking for a pulse in the lace. "How extraordinary," she said. 2 words, measured and soft. The kind of words that are not a compliment, but have borrowed a compliment's clothing. By sundown, those 2 words had traveled to every parlor within 20 miles. He heard it from the man who brought the evening post, who had heard it from the farrier, who had heard it from the dry goods proprietor's wife, who had heard it from the woman who had been there. By the time the rancher climbed the porch steps, the story had already grown edges. He came to her in the sitting room. His voice was level in the way that a stretched wire is level, under considerable pressure, giving nothing away unless it snapped. He spoke of reputation. He spoke of expectation. He used the word appropriate 3 times, which was 2 times more than a man of his restraint usually permitted himself. He spoke of the neighbors and what they would think and how a household reflected on a man standing in the territory. He did not raise his voice. He was, in his way, precise. She let him finish. She had learned, in 31 years, the particular value of letting a man finish. When the silence was complete, she folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the steady attention of a woman reading a column of figures before she identifies the error. "How many men," she asked, "are coming on the drive?" He looked at her. "And do you," she continued, "have a plan to feed them?" The fire settled in the grate. He did not answer. He did not answer that evening. He did not answer the following morning either, though she saw the question sitting behind his eyes at breakfast like a piece of furniture he kept walking around and refusing to acknowledge. She did not press him. She had said what needed saying. The rest was arithmetic, and arithmetic did not require her assistance to be true. She began on the second morning. The canning kettle went onto the kitchen stove before the light had fully settled over the mountains, and the smell of brine, sharp, clean, vinegary, moved through the house like an announcement. She worked the way she always worked, without hurry, without waste, with the concentrated attention of a woman who understands that careful hands make fewer mistakes than quick ones. The onions came first, peeled and halved and packed into jars with a precision that was almost architectural. Each layer settled against the next, as if it had always meant to be there. Then the garlic, cloves suspended in pale brine, sealed with muslin and wax, and labeled in her careful, upright hand. The labels told the date, the contents, the approximate use: pickling onions, white, late October, 1883, supper, cold plates, trail provisions. She wrote as if someone were going to need to find these jars in the dark and know exactly what they held. The herbs went next. Sprigs of dried thyme and rosemary lowered into narrow jars of vinegar, the liquid turning faintly amber as it worked. She arranged them on the shelves, not by size as someone decorating a room might, but by season and use. What would be opened first on the left? What would keep the longest on the right? So that the room functioned the way a good ledger functions, immediately readable by anyone who understood its logic. The eggs she saved for last, as she always did. They required the most attention and repaid it most honestly. She hard-boiled them in batches on the kitchen stove, cooled them in the cold water that came up from the pump, peeled each one with the careful deliberateness of someone unwrapping something worth keeping. Into the jars they went, a dozen to a jar, covered in the spiced brine she had been adjusting and tasting since mid-morning. Each jar sealed with wax pressed down by her thumb. Each label written by lamplight. By the end of the third day, the shelves held more intention than anything else in the house. More logic, more quiet planning. The room smelled of vinegar and preserved thyme, and it was, in its own way, beautiful. Not the beauty that had been intended for it, but a different kind. The beauty of a thing that will be genuinely useful when the moment arrives. He came to the doorway on the evening of the third day. She did not turn around. She was pressing the wax seal on the last jar, the label already written, and she set it on the center shelf in the place she had kept empty for it since the first night. She heard him standing there. She heard him leave. The fourth day brought frost on the window panes and a new kind of quiet in the house. She had begun to understand his silences by then. Which ones were indifference, which were calculation, and which were the particular stillness of a man who has noticed something he does not yet have language for. The silence after he left the doorway had been the third kind. She filed it away in the same careful part of her mind, where she kept her brine ratios and her estimated yield counts, and she moved forward. She had been carrying the provisioning plan in her head since Ohio, not in some vague, hopeful way, in numbers, in pounds and portions and preparation hours. She had read his advertisement twice before answering it, and she had noticed, buried beneath the language of social standing and refined appearance, that he ran a working cattle operation in late-season Montana. She had done the arithmetic before she ever packed the trunk. A crew pushing a herd north in early November needed feeding. A ranch cook could fall ill. These were not dramatic possibilities. They were simply things that happened, and a woman who had kept a household running on precise margins for most of her adult life knew better than to leave them unplanned for. She opened the ledger on the morning of the 7th day and copied the numbers cleanly onto a separate page, organized by category. What the ranch already held in its cellar, she had inventoried it the 2nd day, quietly, while he was out in the south pasture. What must be ordered from town before the ground froze hard enough to make wagon travel unreliable. Quantities calculated against 40 men for 3 days, with a margin for weather delay, because weather in Montana did not negotiate. She noted preparation times alongside each item, so the plan could be executed by someone who had never met her, if it came to that. She wanted it to be useful, not impressive. She brought it to him after supper, when the house was settled and the lamp on his desk was burning. She set it on the edge of the desk without ceremony and stood back. He looked at it without touching it first, the way a man looks at something that has appeared where he did not expect it. Then he picked it up and read. She watched his eyes move across the page. Once. A pause at the column of quantities. She saw it, the slight stillness. Then he read it again from the top, more slowly. He said nothing. She did not wait for him to. She had not brought it there for conversation. She had brought it because there were 10 days left before the drive reached the ranch, and 7 of those days would be needed for preparation if the order went to town by morning. The arithmetic was not her opinion. It was simply true. She left the room. And in the morning, when she came down before the light had fully settled over the hills, the foreman was already saddling his horse. She watched from the kitchen window as he rode toward town, and she put the kettle on. The frost arrived on a Tuesday. She knew it before she saw it, felt it in the way the house held its breath in the small hours, the way the floorboards gave a different note beneath her feet when she rose before dawn. By the time the candlelight caught the window glass above the work table, the proof was already there. A thin veil of crystal laced across the lower panes, delicate as stitching, cold as a verdict. 3 days. The narrator does not need to say what 3 days means. She already knows. She has known it the way farmers know rain, not by looking up, but by something older, something that lives in the hands and the shoulders and the particular quality of evening air when the season is preparing to shift its weight. She lit the second candle from the first and set them both on the shelf above the work table, and she worked. The room smelled of vinegar and bay and something deeper underneath. The mineral sharpness of preserved garlic, the faint sweetness of onion gone soft in brine. The jars stood in their rows like a quiet congregation, each one sealed and labeled in her careful hand. Most of them were finished. Most of them had been finished for days. But there were 7 jars left that required a second seal, and she would not send a jar north that she had not checked twice herself. That was not caution. That was simply the standard she kept. She worked without hurry and without haste, two things that are not the same. It was past 10 o'clock when she heard the footfall in the hallway. She did not turn around. The foreman's step had a particular weight to it, deliberate and unhurried, the walk of a man who has learned that arriving loudly is rarely useful. He stopped in the doorway the way he always did, at the edge of the threshold, as though the room had its own jurisdiction, and he respected that. This time, though, he spoke. He said that the trail crew had not eaten a proper meal in 4 days, that the cook they'd hired out of Billings had turned back at the first creek crossing. Bad boots, worse nerve, and that the men had been living on hardtack and what they could boil over a campfire in 20 minutes of evening light. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without complaint or decoration. Just the fact of it, set down like a stone on a table. She lifted the 7th jar, checked the seal along the rim with her thumb, and set it in its place. Then she nodded. Not the nod of someone receiving new information, the nod of someone whose information has just been confirmed. She had suspected as much since the day the order went to town. A cook who quit before the frost was no cook at all, and 40 men driving cattle north in October were not men who could afford to arrive hungry and expect mercy from the work waiting ahead of them. The candles burned low. Outside, the frost deepened its hold on the glass. 2 days. They came at dusk. Not all at once. First the sound, low and rolling, the particular percussion of a large herd moving on frozen ground, hooves striking earth that no longer gave beneath them. Then the dust, pale and thin in the cold air, rising above the ridgeline like smoke from a fire that had been burning a long time. Then the men themselves, dark shapes against a sky the color of pewter, riding in the slumped posture of people who have used up every comfortable position hours ago and have settled into pure endurance. She heard them from the jar room. She did not go to the window. She had already counted the jars that morning, already run the numbers in her ledger the night before, already known what the pantry could answer and what it could not. She wrapped her apron strings twice around her waist and tied them with the same quiet finality she brought to everything. Then she walked out of the room, through the hall, and onto the front steps. He was already in the yard. He stood with his arms at his sides, watching 40 men and a herd that smelled of cold mud and long miles come through his gate, and his face held the particular stillness of a man who has spent his life solving problems with money and has arrived at one that money cannot reach in time. The cook was gone. The kitchen was cold. The hands who worked his own ranch could not feed 40 trail men on top of their own exhausted evening. He knew the numbers as well as she did. He simply had no answer for them. She walked past him. Not quickly, not dramatically. She simply walked, with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who knows exactly where she is going and has known for 2 weeks. She did not look at him as she passed. She did not need to. The foreman saw her move. He had been watching the yard from his place near the barn, as he watched everything, quietly, without announcement. When she stepped off the porch toward the kitchen door, he straightened, pushed off the fence post, and followed. Not with any word spoken between them. He simply understood, the way he always understood, that motion in a certain direction from a certain person meant something was about to get done. The nearest ranch hand saw the foreman move. Then another saw the first. Then 3 more fell in behind them, confused but obedient to the momentum of it, the way men will follow a current they can feel even when they cannot see the water. By the time she pushed open the kitchen door and reached for the lamp, the yard was already reorganizing itself around the fact of her decision. Someone was bringing wood. Someone else was pulling the water pump handle in the cold. A trail man, hollow-faced and uncertain, looked toward the light spilling from the kitchen window and took one step toward it. The frost deepened. The night settled in, and she began. The lamp burned steady in the kitchen window, and she worked the way she always worked, without theater, without announcement, with the quiet precision of someone who had thought this through long before the moment arrived. The jars came first. She carried them herself from the small room off the bedchamber, 6 at a time, cradled against her apron. The pickled eggs, 30 of them, dense and pale, suspended in their spiced amber brine. The onions, translucent and soft with weeks of vinegar and bay leaf. The garlic, the preserved herbs, the small jars of dried pepper she had tucked onto the lower shelf in the second week. The foreman held the kitchen door without being asked. She did not thank him. He did not expect thanks. That was the whole of their understanding, and it had served them both well. The ranch stores provided the rest. Salt pork, dried beans that had been soaking since midday, because she had begun soaking them the moment she saw the sky that morning. Flour, lard, the last of the late-season onions from the cellar. She set water to boil and fat to render, and she moved through the kitchen the way a river moves, without hesitation, finding the path between obstacles as though the obstacles had no say in the matter. What came out of that kitchen in the following hour was not delicate. It was not meant to be. The beans came first, thick and smoky, brightened at the last moment with a spoonful of the spiced brine that opened on the tongue like a small shock. Something warm and sharp and alive in the middle of a cold night. The eggs followed, sliced and laid across the top of the beans in the deep serving dishes, soaking the heat into their preserved centers. The vinegar softened now, the spice present but quieted, the richness of them unexpected and deep. The herbs she had scattered into the warming pans bloomed in the heat, thyme and dried sage and something she had put up from her mother's recipe that had no name in English, and the smell of it moved through the kitchen and out into the yard, and 40 trail men followed it without quite deciding to. They ate in shifts, standing and seated both, tin plates filled and refilled. They did not speak much. Hungry men rarely do, not in the first wave of it. They ate with the focused silence of people who have been cold and empty, and are now, suddenly, neither. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, the silence changed, became the other kind, the satisfied kind, the kind that hums and exhales and occasionally laughs at nothing in particular. He ate among them. He had come in late, taken a plate without ceremony, found a place at the end of the long table. She saw him sit. She did not watch him, but she saw. Somewhere between the first plate and the last, the set of his shoulders changed. The careful arrangement of a man holding his position. The pride carried like a tool he had forgotten he was gripping. Quietly put itself down. When the last man had rolled his blanket and the yard had gone quiet, the house settled into itself. The particular silence of a place that has held more than it expected and is still measuring the weight of it. She banked the kitchen fire, wiped down the long table, set the remaining jars back in their order. The work was familiar, and she let it carry her, hands moving without instruction, the way hands do when a woman has done something, enough times to trust them. When the kitchen was done, she stood for a moment at the window. The frost had come in full now, silvering the grass, and the stars above the valley were the hard, bright kind that only appear when the cold has cleared everything soft from the air. She had expected to be tired. She was not. She found him in the small room off the bedchamber. He was standing at the center shelf with his back to her, and he was holding the first jar she had ever sealed. The one placed there on her first night, set like an anchor while the rest of the house still believed she was something decorative. He had not opened it. He was only holding it, the way a man holds a thing when he is trying to understand what it has been trying to tell him. She did not announce herself. She came in and stood near the door and waited. He turned. He looked at her without any of the careful arrangement she had grown accustomed to, without the pride carried like armor, without the assessment of a man calculating the gap between what he purchased and what arrived. He looked at her the way people look at one another when they have run out of performances. "What else do you know?" he asked. She told him, not quickly, not to impress him. Plainly, the way she did everything, with the calm of a woman who has always known the worth of her own knowledge and only waited for someone willing to receive it. She told him about winter stores and trade routes and what a ranch needs to carry 40 men comfortably, and what it needs to survive a season when the cattle market drops and the cold runs long. She told him about 3 different methods of preserving and the difference between feeding a household and feeding a territory. She told him all of it, and he listened, and he did not interrupt. By morning, the marriage contract, the one that had listed her obligations like inventory, her refinement like a condition of purchase, lay in pieces in the cold grate. He had drawn up another document, 2 columns, both names, equal lines. She read it slowly, because careful reading is its own form of respect, and then she signed it with the same hand that had labeled every jar, steady, deliberate, belonging entirely to herself. Outside, the frost held. The valley was still. She had come to Montana under someone else's terms. She stayed under her own.